Series Sovereignty Files, story end June 2023. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Somewhere in Eastern Europe, a woman is still running. She has $25 billion that doesn't belong to her. She promised the world a revolution. She delivered a ghost. Her name is Ruja Ignatova. They called her the Crypto Queen, and she vanished, the way all great lies do, without a trace. This is not the story of a hacker who broke into a system. It is not the story of a rogue algorithm, a market collapse, or a design flaw. This is the story of a woman who looked at the entire human desire to belong to something transformative and weaponized it, who understood at a level most people never reach that you don't need to build a real product if you can build a real belief. Who understood that in a world where a new technology was creating genuine millionaires and generating genuine excitement and producing genuine social transformation, the most valuable thing you could manufacture was not the technology itself, but the experience of owning it. The cryptocurrency that never was, the blockchain that never existed. The revolution that was, from the very beginning, a stage set complete with lights and music and a founder in designer clothing who stood at the center of it all and looked with extraordinary precision like the future. OneCoin ran for 5 years before the full scope of the fraud was understood. In that time, it reached 6 continents, 3 million claimed members, and approximately $25 billion in losses. A number so large that it requires the kind of contextualization that financial fraud rarely receives. Because fraud at this scale is not about money. It is about the specific human experiences that money represents. The retirement that cannot now be retired into, the education that cannot be funded, the safety that was supposed to come from making one good decision, and that instead vanished in the space between a promise and the truth. This is the story of OneCoin. The year is 2014. Bitcoin is 3 years old. Most people still don't understand it. But Ruja Ignatova understands something more important. She understands that people want to believe. She was born in Bulgaria in 1980 in the city of Rus, a city on the Danube with an unusual history, more culturally connected to Vienna and Budapest than to the rest of Bulgaria. Her family was educated, professional, aspirational. When Ruja was 10 years old, her family moved to Germany, to the city of Schramberg in Baden-Württemberg. She adapted quickly. She learned German. She excelled in school. She earned a law degree from the University of Constance, one of Germany's most respected institutions, then a doctorate in European private law from Oxford's partner institution. She was brilliant, she was ambitious, she was fluent in the language of finance, law, and authority. She spoke 4 languages. She could stand in a room full of lawyers and be the most prepared person there, and she was. She returned to Bulgaria in the mid-2000s and entered the post-communist financial landscape that Eastern Europe represented at that moment. A world whose regulatory architecture was new, whose enforcement mechanisms were still developing, and whose business culture contained both genuine opportunity and significant space for individuals who understood how to move through gaps in institutional oversight. The Eastern European financial environment of the 2000s was not uniquely corrupt, but it was uniquely transitional. A landscape where the formal rules of a market economy had been adopted faster than the institutions needed to enforce them, and where connected, intelligent, legally fluent individuals could accomplish things that would not have been possible in more established regulatory environments. Ruja was connected, intelligent, and legally fluent. She joined a financial consulting firm, engaged in a series of business ventures, and accumulated both money and the specific knowledge of how transactions actually flowed through the borderlands between legitimate commerce and its alternatives. She launched a steel recycling company called Relas Technologies. It failed. Under German court proceedings in 2012, She was convicted of fraud in connection with the collapse, a conviction that did not make headlines, did not follow her, and did not slow her down. The conviction deserves a moment of attention because of what it reveals about the character of what followed. A person who experienced a fraud conviction in 2012, documented on the public record in German court proceedings, and then 18 months later, launched what would become the largest cryptocurrency fraud in history, is not someone who was pushed into deception by circumstance or temptation. She was someone who had processed the 2012 failure as information about what worked, what failed, what needed to be done differently at larger scale. The gap between Rylas Technologies and OneCoin was not a gap between the person who committed the first fraud and the person who built the second. It was a gap in execution, a period of learning and preparation during which Ruja identified the specific opportunity that the emerging cryptocurrency market represented. Because Ruja did not experience failure the way most people do, she processed it as data, as information about where the gaps were, where the rules could be stretched, where belief outpaced scrutiny. And in 2013, watching Bitcoin from the outside, the way a chess player watches an opponent's opening move, she found the gap she had been looking for. She saw what Bitcoin had created, not just a technology, a feeling, the feeling of being early, of being part of something that was going to change everything, of standing at the threshold of a new financial world while the old one crumbled. That feeling, the feeling Bitcoin's early believers carried with them, had made some people extraordinarily wealthy. And now millions of people who had missed it were desperate for a second chance. The analysis she made of the cryptocurrency market in 2013 was in its own way brilliant. She understood something about the mechanics of new technology adoption that even the legitimate cryptocurrency industry has sometimes failed to fully grasp. That most people who enter a new technology market are not buying the technology. They are buying what they imagine the technology will do for them. The financial security, the social status, the sense of being among the visionary early adopters whose prescience will eventually be rewarded. Bitcoin had created an entire culture built around this experience, and that culture was, by 2013, actively looking for the next opportunity to replicate it. Ruja's insight was that the culture, the feeling of early adoption, the community of believers, the narrative of disruption, could be manufactured separately from the underlying technology. You didn't need a real cryptocurrency to sell the experience of owning one. You needed a presentation, a community, a pricing structure that made early participants feel validated, and a name recognizable enough to generate the specific social dynamics that turned investors into recruiters. Ruja Ignatova had no intention of building a cryptocurrency. She had every intention of selling the feeling of owning one. In 2014, she founded OneCoin Limited in Sofia, Bulgaria, registered in the jurisdiction that was most familiar to her, whose regulatory environment she understood most deeply, and whose connections to the broader global financial system made it possible to move money with a degree of flexibility that more heavily supervised jurisdictions would not have permitted. The registration in Bulgaria was not incidental. It was deliberate positioning in a regulatory gap, a European Union member state where the credibility of EU membership could be invoked when necessary, but where the specific oversight mechanisms for novel financial products were still being developed. The choice of jurisdiction told an expert observer everything they needed to know about the operation's intentions. For the millions of investors who would eventually encounter OneCoin through a presentation in Manila or Lagos or Frankfurt, the Bulgarian registration was simply an administrative detail beneath a stage production that was designed to communicate global authority and technological legitimacy. Her pitch was simple, seductive, and perfectly timed. Bitcoin is for nerds. OneCoin is for everyone. Bitcoin is volatile. OneCoin is stable. Bitcoin is complicated. OneCoin is easy. She stood on stages in Dubai and London and Sofia and Singapore. She wore designer gowns, Versace, Dior, custom Bulgarian couture, and spoke with the unshakable confidence of someone who had already won. She told audiences that OneCoin would replace Bitcoin, that it would become the #1 cryptocurrency in the world, that early investors would become millionaires. No, billionaires. She cited technical specifications that sounded authoritative to anyone who didn't know better. She referenced blockchain capacity figures that dwarfed Bitcoin's. She showed slides with transaction speeds and scalability metrics that implied OneCoin was the technological superior of everything that had come before. The specific presentation dynamics that OneCoin events deployed were not accidental or improvised. They were the product of deliberate design by people who understood from experience in multi-level marketing and mass persuasion exactly which psychological levers to engage in, which sequence to produce the outcome they wanted. The opening of a OneCoin event was designed to create social proof through visible enthusiasm. Testimonials from existing members who had seen their account values rise, carefully selected and rehearsed, delivered with the authenticity of real belief, because the presenters often genuinely believed what they were saying. The middle section was designed to create intellectual engagement, technical slides, blockchain terminology, comparisons to Bitcoin that positioned OneCoin as the superior successor rather than a competitor. The close was designed to create urgency, limited time pricing on packages, leaderboards showing how many people in the room had already signed up, the specific framing of "don't be the person who was at the Bitcoin presentation in 2010 didn't buy." The sequence was a masterwork of applied behavioral economics deployed in service of fraud, and it worked with devastating effectiveness across cultures, languages, and financial sophistication levels, because it was targeting human psychology, not financial knowledge, and human psychology is substantially universal. And the audiences in hotel ballrooms and convention centers across 6 continents responded. They applauded, they signed up, they recruited their families, because she sounded like she knew, because the stage was enormous and the production values were Hollywood, because the numbers were dazzling, because standing in that room felt like standing at the beginning of something historic, and because the deepest human fear, the fear of missing out, is more powerful than reason. Let's talk about what OneCoin actually was. Not what Ruja said it was, what it actually was. A real cryptocurrency runs on a blockchain, a public distributed ledger of transactions, validated by a decentralized network of computers that no single party controls. Bitcoin's blockchain has been running continuously since January 3, 2009. It has processed over 1 billion transactions. Every transaction is publicly visible, permanently recorded, and mathematically verifiable by anyone with an internet connection. You can look up any wallet address, any transaction, any moment in the entire history of Bitcoin, right now, for free. OneCoin's blockchain was never public. It ran on a single server in Sofia, Bulgaria, a server that OneCoin controlled entirely. When independent investigators, journalists, regulators, cryptocurrency researchers asked to examine the blockchain, they were told it was proprietary. When court-appointed forensic analysts finally got access, they found something extraordinary. The blockchain had been reset multiple times, not updated, reset. The historical transaction record had been deleted and rewritten. It was not a financial ledger in any meaningful sense. It was a database managed by a company to show whatever numbers the company chose to show. It was, in plain language, a spreadsheet with a blockchain sticker on the outside. The technical sophistication required to see through it was not high. Any person with a basic understanding of how distributed ledgers work could have identified in 15 minutes of questioning the fundamental fraudulence of OneCoin's claimed technology. The problem was not that the fraud was hard to detect. The problem was that the vast majority of the people who encountered OneCoin had no baseline of knowledge from which to detect it. In 2014 and 2015, cryptocurrency was still sufficiently novel that the number of people who could meaningfully evaluate a claim about blockchain capacity was genuinely small. Ruja's pitch was calibrated specifically for an audience that wanted to believe but didn't have the technical background to verify. And that audience was in the mid-2010s, essentially the entire global, non-technical population. She spoke with the authority of someone who had studied the technology carefully, and she was lying with the precision of someone who understood that the lie was structurally unverifiable by its intended audience. But the structure through which this spreadsheet was sold to the world was genuinely disturbingly clever. OneCoin did not sell cryptocurrency directly. That would have been too easy to scrutinize. Instead, OneCoin sold educational packages, PDF documents and video courses about cryptocurrency, trading, and financial independence. The courses had names like Starter, Advanced, Pro, Premium, Tycoon Trader, and the top tier, the Deal Shaker package. Prices ranged from €140 for the entry level to over €118,000 for the highest tier. Each package came with a number of tokens. These tokens could be used to mine OneCoin, a process that happened automatically on OneCoin servers without any actual computational work. The mined coins accumulated in your OneCoin account. They could be traded on XCoinX, OneCoin's internal exchange. But there was a critical detail. Withdrawals to external wallets, to your Bitcoin wallet, your bank account, your real financial world, were always restricted. There were withdrawal windows, withdrawal limits, withdrawal requirements. In practice, for most users, in most markets, most of the time, you could not get your money out. The value shown in your OneCoin account was as real as numbers on a casino screen before you cash out, and the cashing out was always just around the corner, always about to be enabled, always pending one more upgrade or regulatory approval. On top of the package sales sat the real engine, a referral pyramid. Recruit someone into OneCoin, earn a commission on their package purchase. Recruit 10 people, earn commissions on their recruits. Climb the ranks: bronze, silver, gold, sapphire, ruby, diamond, crown diamond, blue diamond. Each rank unlocked higher commission percentages from the people below you. The top earners in the system made millions, not from cryptocurrency appreciation, but from recruiting. This was not incidental to the structure. This was the structure. OneCoin was a multi-level marketing scheme, wearing a blockchain costume, a pyramid wrapped in the vocabulary of financial innovation. And the vocabulary was doing enormous work. Because in 2014 and 2015, the vast majority of people who might consider investing in cryptocurrency, the global middle class, the aspiring investor in Lagos or Manila or Bucharest, could not independently verify what a blockchain was, how it worked, or whether OneCoin's version was real. They trusted the presenter. They trusted the stage. They trusted Ruja. And Ruja had spent years learning exactly how trust works. Between 2014 and 2017, OneCoin spread across 6 continents. It moved through developing markets with particular speed, carried by networks of enthusiastic promoters who earned meaningful commissions and recruited from communities that had limited access to traditional financial services. Uganda, Pakistan, India, China, Nigeria, Brazil, Indonesia, the Philippines, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States. The infrastructure that OneCoin built to sustain its global expansion was, in many ways, more sophisticated than the operations of legitimate financial companies operating at comparable scale. The company maintained offices in multiple countries, employed hundreds of full-time staff across legal, compliance, technology, and marketing functions, and operated the XCoinX internal exchange, however fraudulently, as a functioning piece of software infrastructure. The compliance function was particularly revealing. OneCoin had a head of legal and compliance whose job, in the formal organizational chart, was to ensure that the company met its regulatory obligations. In practice, as the prosecution of Irina Dilkinska later established, compliance at OneCoin was a mechanism for managing the appearance of legitimacy rather than its substance, for producing documentation that could be shown to regulators or courts without the underlying reality that the documentation was supposed to represent. The existence of a compliance function was itself part of the deception. It allowed OneCoin to respond to regulatory inquiries with the vocabulary of a supervised institution, buying time in each jurisdiction while the operation continued extracting money. In some countries, OneCoin operated openly through registered entities. In others, it moved through informal networks, WhatsApp groups, home meetings, church communities, neighborhood associations. The message adapted to each culture. In markets with strong Islamic finance traditions, OneCoin promoters emphasized that it was halal, permissible under religious law, because it didn't involve interest payments. In African markets with histories of currency instability, the pitch centered on financial sovereignty, owning something that no government could inflate or confiscate. In European markets with memories of economic crisis, the pitch was diversification, protecting savings from banking system failures, like those that had wiped out Cypriot depositors in 2013. In every market, the pitch was personalized, local, and built around the specific financial anxieties of the audience. At its peak, OneCoin claimed 3 million members globally. Some investigators believe the real number was lower because OneCoin had incentives to inflate membership counts for promotional purposes. But the money was real, $25 billion. That is the figure that U.S. federal prosecutors and independent forensic analysts have estimated as the total raised by OneCoin between 2014 and 2019. Not millions, not hundreds of millions. $25 billion. Let that number settle. To put it in context, the 2011 earthquake and tsunami that devastated northeastern Japan, one of the most expensive natural disasters in recorded history, caused approximately $235 billion in damage. OneCoin extracted more than 10% of that figure from private individuals. From teachers in Bangladesh who sold family land to buy the tycoon trader package because their uncle said it would be worth 10 times as much in 2 years. From nurses in Uganda who borrowed from their mothers and their neighbors and their church members because the presentation showed them a chart of projected returns that made retirement feel possible for the first time in their lives. From retirees in Germany who invested their life savings, €50,000, €80,000, €150,000, because a woman with a German doctorate and impeccable credentials was standing on a stage in Frankfurt telling them that their pension funds were insufficient and OneCoin was the solution. From entrepreneurs in Malaysia who raised communal funds, pooled contributions from 30 or 40 individuals in their social network, and attended OneCoin leadership summits in Sofia or Dubai, feeling like pioneers. The geographic distribution of OneCoin's losses also reflected a deliberate strategy of targeting markets where cryptocurrency awareness was high, but regulatory supervision was minimal. Ruja and her team understood that the most dangerous markets for a fraud of this structure were not the most sophisticated ones. They were the ones with the most engaged and technically literate cryptocurrency communities, where journalists and regulators and independent researchers were paying close attention to what was happening in the space. The strategy was to build rapid penetration in markets where those counterweights were weaker, developing economies where financial access was genuinely limited, where the pitch of revolutionary new money resonated with real economic anxieties, and where the regulatory infrastructure to investigate a multinational financial operation was still nascent. This was not accidental. The OneCoin leadership held specific training sessions for regional promoters about which regulatory environments were most and least favorable, how to navigate questions about licensing and oversight, and how to position the product in markets with strong religious or cultural frameworks around finance. The operational sophistication of the geographic strategy was, in its way, more impressive than any legitimate cryptocurrency's approach to market expansion. The recruitment machine was relentless and sophisticated. Leaders held events in five-star hotel ballrooms in Lagos and Manila and Cape Town. The events were meticulously produced. Professional lighting, stage design, countdown clocks, simultaneous translation headsets for international audiences. There were testimonial videos, real people describing how they had turned €1,000 into €40,000 in 18 months. There were projection screens showing live OneCoin prices ticking upward. There were leaderboards celebrating the top recruiters of the month. And at the center of every event, on the largest screen, in the opening video, in the climactic moment when the new packages were announced, was Ruja, commanding, radiant, certain, the crypto queen, and the message never changed. You are early, you will not regret this. Tell your friends. Behind the stage, there was a different world, one where the vocabulary of cryptocurrency revolution was still present, but the underlying reality was the management of a global fraud operation whose continued existence depended on a small number of people maintaining their nerve and their coordination across 50 countries and multiple time zones. Sebastian Greenwood was Ruja's co-founder and the global head of sales, a Swedish man in his mid-30s, whose professional background ran through multiple network marketing operations, some legal, some questionable, all of them providing him with the specific expertise he brought to OneCoin, a finely tuned understanding of human motivation, of the need for status and belonging, of the power of a compelling narrative about the future told by someone whose confidence was professionally calibrated. He designed OneCoin's compensation structure, the ranks, the percentages, the commission rates, the escalating incentives that kept promoters recruiting at volume long after their rational assessment should have raised questions about the underlying product. He traveled constantly, Bangkok, Dubai, London, Lagos, Singapore, appearing on stages alongside Ruja, and after her and in her absence, delivering the same message with the same conviction, the same certainty about the future, the same performance of a man who had already seen where this was going and knew it was going to be extraordinary. Whether he fully believed it or whether he was running a calculation the whole time, courts have since examined without fully resolving. And the answer is probably that both were true simultaneously, in the way that the most effective con artists partly convince themselves of the story they are telling, because the performance is more convincing when the performer is not entirely sure it is a performance. Konstantin Ignatov, Ruja's younger brother, occupied a different position in the operation, quieter and less theatrical, less comfortable on stage, but operationally indispensable in the specific ways that matter most when the thing being operated is a sophisticated fraud rather than a legitimate business. He managed the infrastructure in Sofia, the servers, the code, the administrative apparatus, the flow of money through the company's accounts and the accounts adjacent to it. He understood the technical architecture well enough to maintain it, and well enough to understand that what it was maintaining was not what it claimed to be. Though how fully he grasped the legal exposure he was personally accumulating through his management of that infrastructure is something that his subsequent cooperation with federal prosecutors revealed more completely than his demeanor during the operation suggested. Around both of them was a network of regional leaders, men and women in 50-plus countries, who had built their own downlines, earned genuine commissions, held genuine beliefs, and put genuine reputations on the line for something they had been persuaded to believe in. Some were victims who had invested before becoming promoters and who could not psychologically reconcile the money they had spent with the possibility that it was worthless, because acknowledging the worthlessness would have required acknowledging that they had also perpetuated it to the people they had recruited. Some were cynical entrepreneurs who knew the structure was unsustainable but expected to exit before the collapse, collecting commissions on the way down. And some were simply true believers, people for whom OneCoin had provided real income, real community, and real hope, and who defended it with the intensity of converts, because their belief had become part of their identity in ways that evidence alone could not dislodge. The internal culture that OneCoin built around its leadership ranks was itself a mechanism of control, a system that used status, community, and aspiration to keep the most capable and best-positioned people from asking the questions that would have unraveled the operation. The Crown Diamond and Blue Diamond ranks carried genuine prestige in the OneCoin world. The international leadership summits in Dubai and Sofia, the recognition ceremonies, the group photographs with Ruja herself. Being a top OneCoin promoter meant belonging to an exclusive global community of people who understood something that ordinary investors didn't, or so the narrative ran. The people who reached those ranks had invested not just money but identity. Their social networks, their professional reputations, their sense of self-worth had become entangled with OneCoin's continued credibility. This made them the most effective defenders of the operation against outside scrutiny and the most psychologically resistant to evidence that contradicted their investment. Some of them knew, at some level, that the details didn't add up. The incentives to continue believing were powerful enough to override that knowledge for years. By 2016, financial regulators across multiple jurisdictions were paying close attention to OneCoin, and the attention was no longer merely curious. It was investigative. Germany's BaFin, the Federal Financial Supervisory Authority, issued a formal warning in September 2016, stating that OneCoin appeared to operate as an unlicensed securities issuer and that investors faced the risk of total loss. Italy's financial regulator followed with a similar warning. India's Enforcement Directorate began investigating OneCoin operations in the country and arrested multiple promoters. China's public security authorities launched raids on OneCoin events across multiple provinces and detained hundreds of people involved in what they classified as illegal pyramid schemes operating under a cryptocurrency cover. The Financial Times published an investigation. The Wall Street Journal published an investigation. And a BBC journalist named Jamie Bartlett began what would become a years-long investigation, eventually resulting in a podcast called The Missing Crypto Queen that reached more than 50 million downloads worldwide. The regulatory and journalistic walls were closing on all sides, and Ruja, who had been building toward a particular moment, a moment when OneCoin would have achieved enough scale, enough legal standing in enough jurisdictions, enough institutional credibility to make prosecution politically and practically difficult, had not reached that moment. She had taken $25 billion. The moment of sufficient protection had not arrived, and she had a plan for what to do when it was clear that it never would. October 1st, 2017. Lisbon, Portugal. The Web Summit, one of Europe's largest and most prestigious technology conferences, drawing 15,000 attendees, 300 speakers, heads of state, Silicon Valley executives, and the senior leadership of every major technology company with European operations. Ruja Ignatova was scheduled to speak on the main stage, an appearance that would have been the single most legitimizing moment in OneCoin's history. The crypto queen standing alongside the founders of Airbnb and Twitter and the CEOs of Google's European divisions, presenting OneCoin to an audience that included the most influential journalists, investors, and technology executives in the world, on a stage that communicated by its architecture alone that the people on it belonged to the legitimate vanguard of technological progress. She did not appear. The absence was, in retrospect, the first publicly visible crack in the facade, the moment when the stage production failed to produce its central performer on the most important occasion it had ever arranged. People who were close to the inner circle later described a period of increasing tension in the weeks before the Web Summit cancellation. Ruja was aware of the indictment that had been filed in New York, was aware that U.S. law enforcement was building a case that the cooperation of even one well-positioned witness could make prosecution viable, and was aware that the international expansion of OneCoin, including the aggressive push into the American market, had brought the operation directly into the jurisdiction of the prosecutorial machine that had dismantled Madoff and Enron and every major financial fraud of the previous 2 decades. Whether the Lisbon no-show was the beginning of the exit or the moment when the exit became inevitable is something that the investigation has never fully resolved. What is documented is that after October 2017, Ruja Ignatova was never confirmed, seen again in any public context. Her team sent a message that she was ill, that she would reschedule, that she would appear at a smaller OneCoin leadership event later in the month. She canceled that too. And then she was simply gone, not gradually, not in the way that people fade from public life through a series of smaller withdrawals, but completely and without apparent warning to most of the people around her. On October 25, 2017, 3 weeks after the Lisbon cancellation, Ruja Ignatova boarded a Ryanair flight from Sofia to Athens International Airport, a budget airline, no first class, no special arrangements that anyone has been able to document. She landed in Athens, and from Athens, the trail goes cold in the specific way that suggests preparation rather than accident. No confirmed sighting, no airport footage that has been publicly released, no credit card transactions that investigators have been able to trace, no phone activity, no email communications retrieved by any law enforcement agency that has disclosed findings publicly. She vanished, leaving behind $25 billion in losses, 3 million alleged victims, a brother with no succession plan, a company still actively taking money from new investors, and what would become one of the most extensive law enforcement manhunts in the history of financial crime. Konstantin Ignatov stepped into the CEO role without having planned for it. He continued running the operation, not because he was committed to the fraud in the ideological sense, but because the infrastructure was still running, the packages were still being sold, the money was still flowing, and he did not know what else to do with a company that his sister had built, abandoned, and left in his hands without instructions. For almost 2 years he operated the company she had vacated, maintaining the same presentations, the same events, the same recruitment machine, until March 6, 2019, when he stepped off a flight at Los Angeles International Airport and found FBI agents waiting. He was arrested on charges of wire fraud and money laundering. Within months, facing the prospect of decades in federal prison, he made the decision that prosecutors had been hoping he would make. He cooperated. He sat across from federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York and told them what he knew about the server in Sofia, about the blockchain that wasn't a blockchain, about where the money went, about who knew what and when. What he told them became the foundation of the most significant cryptocurrency fraud prosecution in American legal history, and the roadmap that allowed prosecutors to build cases against the network of attorneys, money launderers, and co-conspirators who had kept the operation running for years after the underlying fraud should have been obvious to anyone with access to the books. 3 days before Ruja Ignatova boarded her flight to Athens on October 12, 2017, the U.S. Department of Justice unsealed a sealed indictment. It had been filed in the Southern District of New York, the same jurisdiction that prosecuted Bernie Madoff. The indictment charged Ruja Ignatova with wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. It alleged that she had caused losses of billions of dollars to investors in the United States and around the world. She was not present in the country. She was not in custody. The indictment was a declaration of intent. In June 2022, the FBI took the extraordinary step of adding Ruja Ignatova to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. She was only the 10th woman in the program's history to appear on that list. The reward for information leading to her arrest, $100,000. Europol listed her as one of Europe's most wanted criminals. Interpol issued a red notice, the closest thing to an international arrest warrant that exists, transmitted to police agencies in 195 member countries. And still, nothing confirmed. Investigators built theories. The most credible involved Russia. Ruja had Bulgarian citizenship and German citizenship. She also had connections, family, business, possibly more, that ran through Eastern Europe into Russia. Russia has no extradition treaty with the United States. Multiple former intelligence officials have suggested, on background, to journalists investigating the story, that a woman with $25 billion and the right connections could disappear into the Russian system in a way that would make formal recovery effectively impossible. There were other theories. Reports surfaced that she had traveled, possibly using multiple passports, possibly with plastic surgery altering her appearance, through the Middle East. One investigation tracked a yacht registered to a company connected to Ruja, last seen in the Eastern Mediterranean. A German intelligence report, partially declassified and reported by Der Spiegel, suggested she had received assistance from Christoforos Amanatidis, a Greek national also known as Taki, who had ties to Bulgarian organized crime and had helped manage money flows for OneCoin through offshore structures. Another report, from a Bulgarian investigative journalism outlet, alleged that she had bribed officials in multiple jurisdictions to ensure warning of any imminent arrest operations. None of these theories have been confirmed through public court proceedings. All of them have been taken seriously enough to investigate. The challenge for investigators is that Ruja had, by the time of her disappearance, an extraordinary amount of money available to facilitate exactly the kind of identity concealment and jurisdictional evasion that makes long-term fugitive status possible for those with sufficient resources. $25 billion, even if only a fraction remained under her personal control after the operations, and the money laundering and the expenses of running a global operation, represented a level of financial capability that could sustain virtually any concealment strategy for an indefinite period. Plastic surgery, multiple passports, loyal handlers, properties in non-extradition jurisdictions, the ability to pay the kinds of bribes that ensure advance warning of any law enforcement action. All of these are accessible at the price point that Ruja's accumulation enabled. The U.S. Marshals Service and the FBI have both dedicated significant resources to the search. The result, as of this recording, is an active wanted poster, a $100,000 reward that has not been claimed, and 7 years of confirmed absence. The cryptocurrency community has followed the search with a combination of frustration and dark fascination. Frustration because the ongoing absence of accountability represents the most visible remaining wound from the OneCoin fraud, and dark fascination because the story's failure to resolve into a conventional ending makes it uniquely compelling. Most major financial frauds end with an arrest. The perpetrators are found, prosecuted, sentenced, and eventually the institutional appetite for the story is satisfied by the completion of the legal narrative. Ruja's story has no completion. It is an open wound in the public record of financial crime, a manhunt that has produced no confirmed result after 7 years, and a reminder that sufficient money and sufficient preparation can, in some circumstances, make a person simply vanish from the world that the rest of us inhabit. Sebastian Greenwood, her co-founder and head of global sales, was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand, in November 2018. Thai authorities extradited him to the United States. He fought the charges for years, navigating a complex legal process that stretched across multiple jurisdictions. In 2024, he pleaded guilty in the Southern District of New York to wire fraud and money laundering. He faces a maximum of 100 years in federal prison. He was sentenced and is awaiting the final determination of his case as of this recording. But Ruja remained free as of 2025. As of this recording, 7 years since she boarded a budget airline flight to Athens, still missing, still the subject of an active international manhunt, still somewhere, alive, investigators believe, spending the interest on $25 billion. Let us talk about who was left behind. The story of OneCoin is most often told as a story of fraud, of Ruja's cunning, of the scale of the deception, of the spectacular nature of the disappearance. But the true weight of the story is carried by people whose names rarely appear in the headlines. In the United Kingdom, a woman we will call Linda, because she asked to remain anonymous to protect herself from the shame of having been deceived, invested her entire pension in OneCoin after her sister, who had become a mid-level promoter, convinced her it was legitimate. She transferred £14,000, her entire retirement savings, into OneCoin educational packages in 2016. When she tried to withdraw her funds in 2018, the withdrawal system was down. When she called customer service, the number was disconnected. She is now in her late 60s, working part-time to supplement a state pension that was never designed to be her only income. She has not spoken publicly about what happened to her. She told Jamie Bartlett, who documented her story for the BBC, that the shame of having been deceived is almost as heavy as the financial loss. In Nigeria, a pastor whose name has been reported in multiple Nigerian news investigations promoted OneCoin to his congregation in Lagos. He was not greedy. He was not cynical. He had attended a OneCoin event, heard the presentation, and been genuinely convinced that this was an opportunity that God had placed in his path to improve the lives of his community. He raised the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars from his congregation, teachers, nurses, small business owners, families who trusted him completely. When the collapse became undeniable, he stood before his congregation with nothing to offer but an apology. The investigation of his case by Nigerian authorities found no evidence of personal enrichment. He had believed, and his belief had cost everyone around him. In China, a region in Hunan province saw an estimated $40 million in losses from OneCoin operations before Chinese authorities intervened with a series of raids in 2017. Hundreds of investors were left with accounts showing OneCoin balances they could not convert to anything real. In the aftermath, multiple Chinese investors were prosecuted, not for participating in OneCoin, but for related fraud charges in connection with how they had marketed OneCoin packages to others. The structure of the pyramid ensured that victims, in many cases, had also become perpetrators. In Uganda, sellers mortgaged agricultural land that had been in their families for generations. In Pakistan, families pooled savings that represented years of overseas remittances, money sent home by relatives working in the Gulf. In Brazil, where OneCoin operated through a complex network of local promoters, the collapse left communities fractured because the investment had been social as much as financial. The loss of money was inseparable from the loss of trust in the people who had recommended it. The majority of victims were not wealthy. They were not sophisticated investors who should have known better. They were people for whom this represented not a speculative bet on a new technology, but a life-changing investment that they had been told, by someone they trusted, using language they couldn't fully evaluate, on a stage that looked like authority, was safe. The OneCoin collapse did not just steal money. It stole retirement. It stole education funds. It stole futures that were already fragile. And in community after community, it destroyed something that is harder to quantify than money: the social trust that holds families and neighborhoods together. Brother had convinced brother, mother had convinced daughter, friend had recruited friend. The financial harm was layered over the relational harm in a way that courts cannot calculate and that time may not fully repair. In the years following Ruja Ignatova's disappearance, the legal and financial reckoning unfolded slowly, incompletely, and in courts across multiple continents, a process that produced genuine accountability for some participants while leaving the central figure permanently out of reach. Konstantin Ignatov was sentenced in October 2023 by U.S. District Judge Edgardo Ramos of the Southern District of New York to 3 years in federal prison, a fraction of the maximum he faced, reflecting the substantial cooperation he had provided to federal prosecutors whose ability to build cases against other defendants depended heavily on the detailed operational knowledge that only someone who had managed OneCoin's infrastructure from the inside could supply. He began serving his sentence and was released in 2024 under supervised release conditions. Mark Scott, an American attorney and former partner at a major law firm who had helped launder approximately $400 million of OneCoin proceeds through a network of fake offshore investment funds called the Fenero Funds, was convicted at trial in November 2019 and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. His conviction rested on evidence that he had moved hundreds of millions of dollars through the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and other offshore jurisdictions in structures deliberately designed to obscure the origin of the funds, and that he was a financial professional with sufficient expertise to understand precisely what he was doing and why it was criminal. Irina Delkinska, who served as the head of legal and compliance at OneCoin, a job title that, in context, requires a moment of dark reflection, pleaded guilty in 2023 to racketeering and money laundering charges in the Southern District of New York. 43 people in total had been charged globally across the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, Bulgaria, and multiple other jurisdictions as of 2024, representing the most extensive international prosecution network ever assembled against a single cryptocurrency fraud. Court-supervised processes in multiple countries, seized real estate in Germany, bank accounts in offshore jurisdictions, and luxury goods purchased with OneCoin proceeds. The total recovered and available for distribution to victims across all jurisdictions: the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, Bulgaria, and the other countries that conducted parallel proceedings, represents perhaps $2 to $3 billion, depending on the valuation methodology applied to assets recovered in non-cash form. Against total losses of approximately $25 billion, the recovery rate is somewhere between 8 and 12%, a fraction that, in the literature of major financial fraud recoveries, is actually not unusually low, but that, in the context of the specific people who lost money in OneCoin, represents devastating incompleteness. The gap between the $25 billion that was taken and the $2 or $3 billion that was recovered is not an accounting gap. It is a human gap. The gap between the promise that was made on a stage in a hotel ballroom and the reality that arrived years later in the form of a check for a small fraction of what was lost, if anything arrived at all. Many creditors received no distribution. The process of identifying and verifying claims in a fraud that operated across dozens of jurisdictions through informal networks, often without formal documentation of investment, was so administratively complex that a significant portion of the people who lost money were never formally registered as creditors at all. The gap is not $22 billion. The gap is $22 billion in human lives, in the concrete, material consequences experienced by people who invested money they could not afford to lose. And at the center of all of it, the woman who designed the system, who gave it its legitimacy, who stood on stages and looked into cameras and told the world that the future was here, still missing as of this recording. The FBI's most wanted list still carries her name. The $100,000 reward still stands, unclaimed. The cryptocurrency community, which has spent 15 years trying to explain that blockchain technology is real, that digital assets have legitimate value, that not all of this is a scam, still carries the shadow of her name, because every time the subject of cryptocurrency fraud comes up in mainstream discourse, her face appears. The crypto queen, who built the biggest fraud in the history of digital money, who took $25 billion and who vanished before anyone could make her account for it. The shadow that OneCoin cast over legitimate cryptocurrency development in the specific markets where it was most active deserves acknowledgement as a distinct category of harm beyond the financial losses to individual investors. In multiple African and Asian markets, OneCoin was the first cryptocurrency that large numbers of ordinary people encountered, not as an abstract news story, but as something presented to them in person by someone they trusted in a community context. The experience of losing money to OneCoin did not just harm those specific investors. It shaped how entire communities thought about cryptocurrency for years afterward, as a scam, as a mechanism for extracting money from vulnerable people, as something that legitimate financial actors in advanced economies used to exploit less sophisticated investors in developing ones. That framing, not entirely wrong given what OneCoin was, but entirely unfair to the legitimate cryptocurrency ecosystem, became the default understanding in communities where OneCoin had operated, and it persisted long after the fraud had been exposed and the legitimate alternatives had demonstrated their real value. The reputational damage to cryptocurrency in these markets was a secondary harm that OneCoin inflicted on an industry it was never part of. And that harm compounded across the years in which people who might have benefited from legitimate digital financial tools were kept away from them by the memory of what OneCoin had done. What does OneCoin teach us? It teaches us something that is both obvious and easy to forget. It teaches us that the technology was never the product. The belief was the product. Ruja Ignatova did not sell a cryptocurrency. She could not have sold a cryptocurrency because she did not have one. What she sold was the feeling of owning a cryptocurrency, the feeling of being early to something revolutionary, the feeling of being smarter than the people who didn't understand, the feeling of belonging to a global community of financial pioneers. She sold the emotion that Bitcoin had created, the extraordinary FOMO, the transformation stories, the sense that digital money was the future of human civilization. And she packaged that emotion without the substance, without the technology, without the blockchain, without anything real at all. And the devastating irony is this: she was not wrong about the future. Cryptocurrency did change the world. Bitcoin did appreciate by orders of magnitude. Ethereum created an entirely new paradigm for programmable money. Stablecoins transformed remittances in the developing world. People who invested in legitimate digital assets in 2014 did, in some cases, become extraordinarily wealthy. The emotion she sold was attached to something real. She just removed the real thing and sold the wrapper. The BBC's The Missing Crypto Queen podcast, which ran for 2 series and ultimately reached more than 50 million downloads, did something unusual in documenting the OneCoin story. It followed the investigation in real time, adding episodes as new developments occurred, and in doing so created a public record of the fraud's unraveling that made the investigation itself part of the story. The podcast's journalism surfaced leads that law enforcement subsequently pursued. It identified connections between OneCoin's money flows and organized crime networks in Eastern Europe that had not previously been in the public record. And it built, over hundreds of hours of audio, a portrait of the victims that gave the $25 billion number a human texture that the court documents could not. This was journalism functioning as accountability mechanism, filling the space left by the official investigation's inability to produce the central figure. The podcast could not arrest Ruja Ignatova, but it kept her face in public consciousness in a way that significantly expanded the population of people who might encounter her and recognize her, and that maintained the pressure on investigators who might otherwise have deprioritized a search that was producing no confirmed progress. That gap between the feeling of a revolution and the reality of one is where $25 billion disappeared. The lesson is not that cryptocurrency is fraud. The lesson is that charisma and credentials and a stage and a business plan that sounds revolutionary are not by themselves evidence of legitimacy. The verification tools exist: on-chain analysis, proof of reserves, independent technical audits, the simple act of asking whether a blockchain's transaction history is publicly viewable. These are not difficult questions to ask, and they are fatal questions for any fraud structured like OneCoin. What the OneCoin story demonstrates is that the availability of verification tools means nothing if the culture around a new technology doesn't normalize using them. The early cryptocurrency community's culture of verification, the expectation that claims would be checked against the public blockchain record rather than accepted on the authority of the presenter, was the culture that would have killed OneCoin immediately if it had applied to Ruja's presentations. It didn't apply because OneCoin targeted audiences outside that culture, audiences who were encountering cryptocurrency for the first time and who had no framework for knowing which questions to ask. The spread of that verification culture is one of the most important legacies of the fraud. The understanding, now embedded in every serious cryptocurrency community in the world, that trust requires evidence, and that evidence is not the same as a confident presenter on a large stage. The lesson is that verification is not cynicism, that asking to see the actual blockchain is not a failure of imagination, that trust, in a world where anyone can build a stage and hire a professional lighting crew and design a compensation plan that makes early participants genuinely wealthy, needs to be grounded in something more than the confidence of the presenter. OneCoin set back mainstream cryptocurrency adoption in dozens of countries, not because it was the only fraud in the space, but because it was the largest, the most global, and the most visible. It gave regulators in emerging markets the justification they needed to restrict cryptocurrency entirely. It gave critics the example they cite first and most often. It gave every skeptic their most powerful talking point, and it gave the families of victims, the children of retirees who lost everything, the congregants of pastors who believed, a story they will carry for the rest of their lives. Every time someone says crypto is a scam, somewhere in that sentence is the ghost of Ruja Ignatova. The specific harm she inflicted on the legitimate cryptocurrency industry was not just the money lost or the regulatory restrictions imposed in markets she poisoned. It was the contamination of the category itself, the association between cryptocurrency and fraud that OneCoin embedded in the public consciousness of every market it touched, and that legitimate operators have spent years trying to detach. The people who built Ethereum, who developed the stablecoin infrastructure that transformed remittances in the developing world, who created the decentralized finance protocols that provided genuine financial access to people outside the traditional banking system. All of them were working in an environment shaped in part by the damage OneCoin did to the word cryptocurrency and to the concept of trusting a digital financial platform. The industry they were trying to build was defined, in the minds of millions of people, by the fraud it had attracted. That is one of the lesser discussed dimensions of what $25 billion of theft actually costs. The compound effect on the legitimate ecosystem that was trying to build something real in the same space where the fraud had operated. Still running, still spending, still carrying the weight of 3 million people's trust in a bag she never meant to return. Close your eyes one more time. The lesson of verification, that trust in a financial context requires evidence, not credentials, is one that the OneCoin fraud teaches with particular force because the credentials were so convincing. A German doctorate, fluency in 4 languages, a conviction style that communicated absolute certainty, a stage production that communicated institutional seriousness. Everything about the presentation signaled legitimacy to an audience that had no independent means of verifying the substance beneath the style. The lesson is not that credentials are meaningless. It is that credentials are about the past and the person, while the specific claim being made requires specific, verifiable evidence that is entirely independent of who is making it. The question, is this blockchain real, cannot be answered by looking at the presenter's educational background. It can only be answered by examining the blockchain itself, by demanding access to the public ledger, by checking whether independent nodes are running, by verifying that the transaction history is genuine and publicly auditable. OneCoin's blockchain was not publicly auditable because it wasn't a blockchain. That fact was available to anyone who asked the right question. The fraud persisted for as long as it did because the right question was not being asked, and because the presentation was designed to make the right question feel unnecessary and impolite. Somewhere tonight, Ruja Ignatova may be sleeping, perhaps in luxury, perhaps in fear, perhaps in both. The woman who built the largest cryptocurrency fraud in history, who convinced millions of people that the future was already here, who stood on stages in 60 countries and looked into the eyes of people who trusted her and took everything they had and walked away, or ran, or vanished, the way all great lies eventually do. But the victims are still here, still living in apartments they cannot leave because they mortgaged them, still working jobs they had planned to retire from, still carrying the particular shame of having been deceived, not by a stranger on the internet, but by someone they trusted, in a room where everyone else was trusting too. The Crypto Queen is the real history of money is not written in code. It is written in the lives of the people who trusted. In the teacher in Bangladesh who sold the family land. In the pastor in Lagos who stood before his congregation with nothing to offer but an apology. In the retiree in Germany who is still working the job she planned to leave. In the remittance savings in Pakistan that never became the house they were meant to build. These are the receipts of $25 billion. These are the faces behind the number, and they will remain faces without resolution for as long as the woman who built the operation that harmed them remains beyond the reach of the legal processes that exist to hold people who cause this kind of harm accountable. In the silence where the answers should be, in the space between what was promised and what arrived, and in the ongoing, unresolved absence of a woman who still owes the world an accounting, who is somewhere tonight, still running, still beyond the reach of every law enforcement agency that has spent years searching, still carrying the weight of 3 million people's trust into a future that none of them were invited to share.